Hello, everyone. Mark here, and today we are doing the third entry in the Six Principles of Training series, covering the Six Principles of Training by Kondo Katsuyuki Sensei, translated into English by Derek Steele. Today we are covering Maai, or distancing. The text that we will be covering today can be found in the book right behind me, Daito-ryu Aiki Jujutsu Hiden Mokuruku Ikkajo. I will be adding in the description below a link to the same text that can be found at kodio.com for those who want to follow along. So without further ado, let's get started. I will first do a full reading of the text so that we can kind of all have it in mind, after which I will rewind to the beginning and do a sentence-by-sentence breakdown with additional explanations and context. So let's get started. Maai, distancing. Maai refers to the physical distance or interval between things. Maai is often the single most important factor in determining the outcome of a combative encounter. It sometimes happens, for instance, that a combatant thinks he has established a favorable Maai only to have it suddenly turn out to be to his opponent's advantage. Primarily a form of unarmed combat, Daito-ryu focuses on the diligent study of the closer Maai characteristic of striking and grappling techniques, although other Maai may also come into play in some situations. So that's the text that we're covering today. Let's rewind back to the beginning and start back with the first sentence and see what we can find in it. So, Maai refers to the physical distance or interval between things. I think that's a good description. Again, pretty short. It's important to think about Maai not just in terms of space, but really in terms of space-time. Static distance in and of itself is not necessarily an instructive concept to discuss. It's really in function of, a number of additional factors that are contextual. So at what speed an opponent can move, are they armed or unarmed, and what kind of weapons they're carrying, what kind of secondary weapons do they have access to. All of those things will, and how quickly, you can draw and access a specific weapon, for instance. All of those things are going to have a great influence on the notion of Maai. And it's not just about whether things are far or close to each other, but it's also, the speed at which you can fill those gaps, essentially. Maai is often the single most important factor in determining the outcome of a combative encounter. I think it's hard to argue with that. If you look at the overall six principles, Maai is probably the one. They're all pretty much portable to any martial arts, in my opinion. But Maai is really the one that I think is the most applicable. Kuzushi would be a close second, but if you are encompassing martial arts that are like weapons based or striking and so on and so forth, disbalancing an opponent may or may not really play a role into managing them and defeating them or neutralizing them or whatnot, right? Whereas Maai definitely plays a role every time, basically. So it's a good point to make here. And it's also important to keep in mind that it's not static, right? You may think you have the advantage, and that next sentence is getting into that subject. You may think you have the advantage, and you might have that advantage at a given point in time, but that may change very quickly just based on one, factor unrelated, not directly connected to the distance management, but still having an impact on it indirectly. So those are all things that are really important to keep in mind here. It sometimes happens, for instance, that a combatant thinks he has established a favorable Maai only to have it suddenly turn out to be to his opponent's advantage. Like I was mentioning, basically, that things can change rather quickly. You may have a strong position and then just one small thing changes and you lose that advantage. There is something here that is being hinted to that's quite interesting, I think, though, specifically to if we're speaking about Daito-ryu. But again, I would argue it's easily applicable to a number of other practices. There is a notion of deception and like kind of reeling in your opponent included in here, right? So it's not just about managing your distance, but it's also making sure that you basically convince your opponent that they are in a either safe or advantageous distance, while they basically, are not, essentially, right? And so it's not enough to just basically manage the distance so that you remain safe, although it is definitely the first step. But you also need to basically make sure that you manage the opponent's perception of distance, essentially, so that you can successfully manage an outcome. Primarily a form of unarmed combat, Daito-ryu focuses on the diligent study of the closer Maai characteristic of striking and grappling techniques, although other Maai comes into play in some situation. I think that's, true, although maybe one thing that's somewhat omitted here is that you're also trying to handle individuals that may have weapons, if not weapons drawn, weapons accessible. So maybe a secondary weapon like a small blade or short stick or whatnot. So those are things that you will encounter in the kata, or at least the kata do teach valuable principles in regards to responding to attackers, having access or leveraging certain weapons. So it's not just pure, it's not about grappling in the commonly understood sense, really. You can think about it in terms of maybe kogusoku to some degree, although we're not starting from a position ourselves in the kata where we're holding a weapon, right? This being said, you will in the kata that have been designed, you will basically draw a weapon at the end often. So that's also something to keep in mind when managing the distance. It's also important, and I think that's something that tends to be ignored often, is the idea that your management of distance doesn't end because you've successfully applied a technique. And this is one of the reasons why I constantly try to emphasize that you're not practicing in Daito-ryu a technique, you are practicing a kata. Not only because the distance management prior to the application of the technique is of importance to the lessons to be learned, but also because once you've applied the technique, you need to get out of there. And you're going to see that in the execution of the kata, how you pull back from the individual, in which direction, what kind of distance you actually open in between the opponent and yourself. Now, those are all important in terms of learning to manage distance, right? You have to keep in mind that the opponent, even if you've applied a technique and if you pull back, there's nothing that stops the opponent from, trying to get back at you. If you angered them, that might actually be a quite realistic outcome, right? Now, obviously, depending on circumstances, you're probably not just going to apply a technique and run away. So that's not necessarily combat realistic. But, again, kata being, tools to teach principles, how you get out of the situation after applying a given technique is something that should be practiced in earnest. And you have to basically make sure that you do this properly. It's one of the biggest problems that I see when, in training, when people are applying or practicing the kata, is they'll basically practice with a high level of focus until either the technique is done and then they're going to mess up their zanshin, or, they're going to do a zanshin really well, and then they start to relax there and there. Instead of basically, as they go back to their initial position, make sure that they keep their attention on the opponent and continue to manage the distance, in the sense that, you keep enough distance to remain responsive to an opponent who might actually still have a grudge against you and still have it in them to attack you. So those are important principles, and they're all connected with Maai. And we could go on and on and on when discussing kata about Maai. I think it's the one thing that's really it is definitely along with the other 5 other principles here. It's definitely one of the most important principle in Daito-ryu, and arguably, again, I think it is the most pervasive major principle that can be found in any martial practice. I wouldn't be able to really think about a lot of at least combat oriented martial arts, and I don't mean necessarily combat application. I mean hand to hand practices that are meant to be representative of hand to hand combat, or even weapons combat. Basically, it's hard to think of a practice where Maai is not, or the distance management is not crucial to the outcome. Basically, right? So it's really important to put a lot of focus on that. And as part of Daito-ryu, that means really when you practice the kata, you have to practice them with a constant care about how much distance in space and in time you're opening between yourself, your opponent, and also other potential object in your surroundings, right? You managing a distance is not just about like making sure that you keep distance from your opponent. In the context of the dojo, it will be about making sure that you keep proper distance from the walls, so that if you end up applying a technique, you're not throwing somebody through like a wall or plated glass or whatnot, right? That's also part of distance management, right? In a more concrete and real life space, that would be making sure that you are aware at all times of what other furniture and physical objects are in your surroundings, so that you don't end up getting surprised because you bump into one of those and basically maybe lose your balance because of that. So it's there's a lot of different ways Maai can be discussed. And it's really, I guess, if there's one thing I hope viewers are going to keep in mind in their own practice, is that it goes beyond just the distance that you actually create or manage between an opponent prior to the application of a technique, or the interlocking of bodies in a sustained combat situation, basically. So it's really important to think about distance beyond just the core of it. Basically, there's it's well before, well after, and it involves more than just the bodies involved, essentially. So that's it for today. Next time, in the next episode, we will be discussing kokyu, or breathing. As always, if you have any questions or comments, please feel free to put them in the comments down below. Thank you for your time, and until next time.